The third way to use the data property of $.ajax is to still supply a string, not a data object, but use a shortcut function, the serialize function, to build that string. So here's the idea. In normal form submissions, when you're not doing JavaScript, you're just submitting a form, your input elements have names, not IDs, names, the name attribute. And the names automatically become the parameter names, and the text field values automatically become the parameter values. And so the idea of serialize is, let's just mimic this process. Now, we're not doing a normal form submission. JavaScript is responsible for building the parameter string. It can build anything it wants. But why not build it the same way? That way, you just give names to your input elements. You just call serialize, and you're done. You don't have to call val, val, val a bunch of times and possibly escape, escape, escape a bunch of times. And so you typically give the form itself an ID. You look up the particular form. You call serialize. And then you pass that entire string to the data property. So you're building the entire string all at once. The input elements now are the way they are in normal forms. They have names. And of course, in normal forms, you do not have to explicitly call escape. You don't even have JavaScript in normal forms, so you don't have to here either. Now, some people object to this a little bit, because if the input elements have to have names, that means the JavaScript code does not explicitly see what the request parameter names are. They come from the name of the text field, where before the JavaScript code explicitly put in the parameter names, not here. And so some people object to it a little bit and say, well, this is contrary to the kind of separation philosophy of jQuery, that the JavaScript and the HTML are relatively independent of each other, because the JavaScript programmer can't determine what the parameter names are without looking at the HTML. And the HTML programmer can't change the parameter, the names of the input elements, without messing up the JavaScript code. Yeah, maybe that's a reasonable argument, but this is so much easier that it's wildly popular, and it's the approach that I personally prefer. Okay, so I dramatically shorten the way that I get the string. This is still a string. The output of serialize is a string. But I just say, go to the form that has this ID, and then build a string the same way a browser would build a string in a normal form submission. So the ID, the form has to now have an ID. How do browsers normally build strings in normal form submissions? We covered that when we looked at HTML. They use the name properties, not the ID, the name properties of the input elements. So your input elements now have to have name properties. So it's not quite as separated as cleanly as before, but it's so much simpler that it's well worth that small downside. So if I run this third example, it behaves just like the previous examples, but our JavaScript code was simpler. So the HTML author had to put in names that match the parameter names that the server expects. But it's a lot simpler, and the URL encoding happens automatically. So that's the approach I recommend you use in most of your applications.